Our first speaker is Margo Hill. And Margo is an attorney. She's a professor in Eastern Washington University in urban planning. It's my neck of the woods, and she's also a Husky. She served as a Spokane tribal attorney, protecting tribal sovereignty, water rights, and land bases of Indian tribes. And I think she would be talking about land tenure today. Next on the list is Heather Dorries. Heather is an assistant professor in the Center for Indigenous Studies and Department of Geography and Planning in the University of Toronto. Is that correct, Heather, University of Toronto? Okay, thanks. Her research is Indigenous planning, indigeneity and urbanism, and Indigenous knowledge systems. And finally, Ted Jojola needs no introduction, but I will do that anyway. Is an educator and practitioner in urban and regional planning with a specialty in Indigenous planning. He's the director of the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute at the University of New Mexico. So this is really a brief introduction in the interest of time. If you want to add anything to your introduction, please feel free to do that. And without any further ado, I'm going to open it up to our panelists. We'll start with Margo, followed by Heather, and then by Ted to share. They have about 10 minutes each to share their works. If you have questions, please put the questions in the text box, and I will organize the questions and make sure that I have time to ask them to the speakers. Thank you. Margo, the stage is yours.
Heo putisin kasihu putisin kwali putisalakhalacht Louis Quest. Hello, everyone. It's such a pleasure to visit with you and talk to you about Indigenous planning. We really haven't had this opportunity, so I have a lot to share. Our research as urban planners, I also got a master's in urban and regional planning after practicing law for 10 years and just loved it, and the problem solving aspect of urban planning and how we can help tribal communities. So I'm going to share with you lots of different work that's both qualitative and quantitative. I come to you from, a legal background, but also behavioral, looking for solutions for our tribal communities. That's something that's different about Indigenous people. I think we don't always just think about theory. We think about solutions for our people at home, because that's where our heart and mind and soul are. So thank you for this opportunity to share. This is a map that I had or an image that I had one of graphics that one of my graduate students helped me put together. So on the Indian reservation, there are layers of laws depending on the land tenure. So if you're talking about a tribal person within the reservation, the land is owned in trust, there's tribal laws that apply. If you have a non-Indian that's doing something, maybe they're polluting or maybe they're trying to build something, it's possibility that state laws can come into apply. And of course, Indian reservations are federal lands. And so federal laws apply when there's certain activities. If there's a major crime like murder, rape, arson, we contact FBI and the US Attorney's Office. So all of these jurisdictions really affect Indigenous planning. We have, whether it's land ownership or rights of way, liability if you're doing economic development, if you're thinking about traffic safety, which I'm going to talk quite a bit about, who owns the road. It might be the county, it might be the tribe, it might be on the BIA, Bureau of Indian Affairs inventory. So there's a whole range of issues. You will have intergovernmental cooperative agreements, cross-deputization agreements, and MOUs and MOAs. And we are currently undergoing a research project with MOAs and MOUs between the state and tribal governments. So if you look at any Indian reservation, it's a very complicated, the historic treatment between and dealings between the United States government and any particular tribe. There's a series of treaties that were broken often. Tribes were moved from different states, different climate regions. But when we reserved the lands to ourselves, we basically ceded, in some cases, like the Yakama Nation, 10 million acres, and they reserved 1.2 million acres to themselves. This is a picture of the Umatilla, Confederated Tribes of Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon, and it gives you a really good picture of the types of land tenure. So sometimes our land, if it's a tribal person within the reservation boundaries, it's held in trust. And that's in a very encumbered concept. We have to basically ask and work with the federal government to do anything. I'm currently working on a personal land transaction, and I have to go to get the paperwork from BIA. I have to wait for appraisals. Any kind of land transactions has to go through a federal process. So trust property is very encumbered, and it's challenging for tribes to do development that all of us, so in America, everybody has fee property, fee simple absolute. That means you have your full bundle of sticks. You can sell it, you can lease it. It's your property. In Indian country, we can't do anything with the bundle of sticks unless we go through the United States government. So you can see the different, we call this checkerboard, non-Indian fee land, tribal land, tribal trust. And so it's a real complicated land tenure. At Eastern Washington University, we have CERTCOM, Small Urban Rural Tribal Center on Mobility. And so we look at tribes across the plains and the Pacific Northwest and identify issues. So we've done lots of focus groups. We've done focus groups out in the community on traffic safety, looking at crash fatalities to reduce the number of fatalities and serious injuries in our tribal communities. We've been, I get my students up, we meet at campus, we drive 3 hours out to the Indian reservation, meet at their community centers, meet at their senior centers, engaging with tribal communities. Of course, this was before COVID. So this is 2.5 years ago that we did this particular group. We look and work with communities to find solutions. One of the big projects was tribal traffic safety, reducing fatalities on reservations. You can see that part of it is relationships with state and public agencies. But in transportation, we know the 4 E's of transportation, engineering, education, and we've modified all of like the mainstream America transportation theory. We modify that for tribal communities. So the 4 E's, engineering, education, you can see on the left of this diagram that we created, enforcement, emergency medical services. But we also added leadership because tribal council in tribal communities play a central role. They pass the laws, they give directives to the tribal court judges to punish DUI offenders. So and they also control the budget. So all of these players within the tribal communities are important. Planning, the court systems, health and human services, EMS, the roads, construction, the engineering, and of course, tribal council. But at the center of the issue is tribal member behavioral choices. So it is tribal members that are continuing to speed, maybe impaired driving, pedestrian habits, wearing dark clothing, seatbelts, properly putting your child in a seatbelt. So all of these issues we consider when we're doing research with tribal communities. We've mapped mobility access to groceries. One way we did this in our Indigenous communities, a lot of folks will go to the Walmart because it will have affordable fresh foods and vegetables. So we mapped distances from reservations to Walmarts. We've also did other maps like distances to healthcare, access to healthcare. So basic access. I've done a lot of work on and research on understanding addiction in tribal communities, because that again is a problem for tribal communities. So we mapped the number of pills that were distributed by pharmaceutical companies and clinics in Washington state, and we did an overlay with the Indian reservations, trying to identify where maybe we had some problems that doctors still needed to work with the tribal communities so they weren't over prescribing. Now we have research across, and we have data banks that share information where people are accessing pharmaceuticals to reduce the number of overprescribing. I was super excited that you guys included activism as part of our Indigenous research, because sometimes we do get involved. We recently changed a name. There was a name along Spokane Falls Community College that was George Wright Drive. He is actually the U.S. colonel that burned our villages for the Spokane Indigenous people. In 1857, we battled with the United States government, and then we again battled in 1858. But there was a street that was named after Colonel Wright. So we worked Indigenous communities, and we lobbied city council and the planning commission, and we worked to get that name changed, and we changed it to Huistoc's Way and honored one of our Indigenous women. So I'm going to move quickly. We map out mobility, how our city is connected to the different tribes. We work with the American Indian Community Center. I do a lot of work with murdered, missing Indigenous women. As an attorney, we look at and map the number of Indigenous people that are missing. We work with Washington State Patrol, identify those areas where at higher risk. As tribal people, we look at the social, the political, the legal factors, some of the biases in law enforcement, maybe the lack of banks and cash systems. All of these lead to some of our problems that contribute to Indigenous people going missing. So I do entire workshops on these. I'm going to skip that past some of the legal and tell you these last couple cool things because that's my time. We recently did an art show and highlighted bringing together artists to do their interpretation of missing Indigenous people. It's a really tough subject to talk about, human trafficking and murder and prostitution, but our people come together and we're artistic as Indigenous people. So we did an art show in which we had grandmothers talk about the, even sometimes sexual violence, but brought together these legal issues and people in the community. It was standing room only. We had like 200 people. And then this next Tuesday, we're doing sovereignty through sustainability. We're bringing together the best scientists, hydrologists, biologists, best attorneys, best urban planners. Joe Tovar will be speaking on we just recently had a bill passed, the Growth Management Act. Tribes can choose to plan under the Growth Management Act. Of course, it's a state law, so it doesn't apply in Indian country. So there's lots of things that I can think about, but I want to be share, but I want to be respectful for other folks' time. So thank you.
Thank you, Margot. Appreciate it. Heather, you're next.
Yeah, thanks so much, Margo. I loved your talk. I didn't know you were gonna. I didn't know you were going to talk about law. And when I was thinking about what I was going to present, I thought about talking about some research that I had started before the pandemic on Indigenous laws, legal orders, and planning. And I decided not to. And now I feel like we got to talk because that was really fascinating. Thank you so much. Thanks also to Manish and Ivis for setting up this session. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this conversation today. I will also say I had a booster vaccine last night in preparation for going on vacation next week, and now I feel terrible, and that's just started within like the last hour. So hopefully I don't fall out of my chair. Can you see my slide? Great. Okay, I'm just gonna make sure I start my timer. Yeah, so I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, which is the traditional territories of the Wendat, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississaugas of the New Credit. This is not my home territory. I'm originally from Manitoba. I grew up in Winnipeg, and I'm Anishinaabe and a member of Saugeen First Nation. I guess what I want to focus on today is some of the challenges that I think that we are faced with in trying to do Indigenous planning or theorize Indigenous planning. And some of the ways that I see this playing out in urban contexts, which is the focus of my research. So I think that, there's been some great developments in planning. Planning has started to recognize how planning is entangled with settler colonialism, and I think has started to grapple with the question of how planning and theories and practices might be decolonized. And this is, I think, a really important, really important movement in our field. And I'm really grateful to the work of people like, of course, Ted, but also Libby Porter, who's, thought a lot about these dynamics. But I think we're still faced with a couple of challenges. I think in Indigenous perspectives, and particularly Indigenous intellectual traditions, continue to be largely absent from these discussions. So with a few exceptions of people like Margo and Ted, who are really thinking about planning from Indigenous perspectives and thinking about the planning that Indigenous peoples have been doing for, since time immemorial, a lot of the work still tends to be on Indigenous people, right? Is making Indigenous peoples the objects of planning theory and practice. And this is often, centering non-Indigenous peoples and institutions and theories as the drivers of decolonization. I think there's still a lot of work that focuses on the damage of colonialism, which is really important. It's an important thing to recognize, but also, we as Indigenous peoples are more than these colonial experiences. I think one other challenge that we're faced with is that a lot of the planning literature and work focuses on Indigenous peoples in non-urban areas. And in some ways that makes a lot of sense. We have a lot of communities that are in on reserve communities, but we still have, particularly in Canada, very large urban Indigenous populations. So this is also something we need to think about, and that I'm trying to think about in my work. I think one of the reasons there is a challenge is because cities are often not thought of as Indigenous places, and Indigenous peoples have been very purposefully removed from cities through processes of settlement, which often erases and displaces Indigenous peoples. But I think when we look across the Americas and look at where cities are located, they're often or almost always located in places that were really important and continue to be really important to Indigenous peoples. So these are Indigenous places. They're on Indigenous territories. They are full of Indigenous people, full of Indigenous life, and yet this is often erased and displaced by urbanization processes. I think a lot of this work is also, or this process of erasure is the result of laws that define urbanization and indigeneity in opposition. And when I look at the Canadian context, there's a very long history of forced Indigenous removal from cities. So cities get positioned and understood as a place of cultural loss or a place of assimilation. So in Canada, reserves were purposefully created at great distance from cities. They were intended to be places where Indigenous peoples would either die out or be assimilated. So they get positioned as places that are antithetical to city. And then at the same time, in the 1960s, there's an explicit process and agenda put forward by the federal government that wanted to encourage Indigenous peoples to move to cities in order to facilitate assimilation. So again, the city gets seen as this kind of like assimilation machine. Right, so we end up understanding urbanity and indigeneity as distinct things. I think indigeneity itself, or the idea of what is Indigenous, is also kind of a fraught category. This term came into common usage following the foundation of the UN Special Forum on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it's become an umbrella term that's a shorthand for describing people with a common political struggle for self-determination and against colonialism. But it's also a term that's started to be used to describe an identity rather than a political relation. So unlike terms such as Inuit or Anishinaabe, which we use to define ourselves in our own languages, Indigenous as a term always stands in relation to colonialism, right? And those struggles against colonialism and for self-determination. So something that scholars in the field of Indigenous studies have been talking about, and I draw a lot on this work, is how to think about indigeneity as an analytic rather than as an identity category. And I think there's similar debates happening in urban studies as well. We understand urbanity as something that's created through a process, not something that's fixed. We know that cities are always in processes of flux, always in processes of change. And I think, thinking about these categories as analytics help us to understand these things as being constantly in flux, constantly in process of change. So rather than thinking about Indigenous as a category of identity, thinking about it as an analytic category means that it allows us to think about, and this is something that Kanaka Maoli scholars Maile Arvin has talked about, this allows us to engage the various power relations that continue to write Indigenous peoples as always vanishing, and recognize how Indigenous peoples configure Indigenous life, and in doing so, configure urban spaces. So if we apply this kind of approach, this analytic approach to thinking about urbanity, this is something that would center or understand Indigenous urbanism as a process that's not just about parsing settler-colonial relations, but also making apparent the ways that indigeneity is mobilized and transformed by urban processes, as well as the ways that indigeneity transforms the urban. So as a conceptual device, this draws attention to the ways that Indigenous people enact Indigenous political authority in urban space to challenge prevailing modes of urbanism. So just as an example, a quick example of some of the things that I then focus on or I'm thinking about as I do this research, I think Indigenous urbanism draws our attention to the kinds of practices that shape Indigenous life in cities and how these in turn shape urban space. So I would think about things like protests or social movement as things that are actively shaping urban space. And this can be seen alongside other practices like creating spaces for ceremony. So here we have on the right side a photo of a sweat lodge in downtown Toronto, thinking about how Indigenous peoples are providing housing. We have on the left side, bottom corner, the Squatches, which is an Indigenous run social enterprise in Vancouver, or artistic intervention, like the work of Ogima Mikina, which is a collective of artists who have, through guerrilla actions, renamed a lot of the streets in Toronto. So that is on the right side. A street I used to live on that was called Indian Road, and here they've changed it to Anishinaabe, Mikina Anishinaabe, the Anishinaabe way is how that would be translated. So yeah, that's just a quick overview of some of the things I've been thinking about, and yeah, I'll be happy to talk more about this, and I'll pass it on. Thanks.
Thank you, Heather. That's absolutely fascinating. The intersectionality between urbanity and indigeneity, it's something that's always fascinated me. Hopefully we can discuss it later after Ted's presentation. Ted, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So greetings everybody from windy New Mexico. We're under the throes of lots of fire warnings, I guess impacted by climate change. It's something that unfortunately we're all seeing, but I think it also underlies the fact that Indigenous planning is so critical in terms of bringing Indigenous knowledge to the forefront, particularly when we look at it not just from the standpoint of tribalism per se, but looking at it from the concept of place-based communities, which is something that I think broadens the expanse of why this is so important in terms of a large amount of our scholarship right now, which is around place knowing. So I'm at the University of New Mexico, the Indigenous Design and Planning Institute. Our mission basically is to inform community development by using cultural identity and values, and using that as a way in order to begin to bring our own identity to the forefront, both in terms of design and in planning. And we've been very successful at integrating this into the academe. We actually just hired our latest faculty position in community and regional planning, Elspeth Urulu, who is the first tenure track professor in Indigenous planning. And also we're now looking at developing a concentration in Indigenous planning, which will be a certificate program that will be online in addition to the IP concentration that we currently have within our graduate program. And we have other faculty that are also Indigenous within planning, as well as architecture now. And we're trying to slowly work with our colleagues in landscape architecture to hire an Indigenous professor, albeit they have made strides in terms of actually offering for the only Indigenous planning studio that's required of their students that I know of in the country. So we're making headway in that. But what I quickly just wanted to share was an example of how you can take this from concept to practice in terms of looking at these kinds of principles, and how it is that we can really think of it both from the standpoint of theory, but also how it actually builds on a sense of actual community practice. So I'm going to switch over to my share, and let's see how this goes. Okay, take me a second here. Okay, get my PowerPoint going. Okay, so we can see the screen, I hope. Yes, good. Okay, so as we all know, one of the things that's really central in terms of our sense of philosophy is the notion of circle, and particularly in terms of how it is that we organize our notion of philosophy, but also it is as it applies to notions of cycle. And when you look at something that is metaphorical like this in terms of its iconography, we think of medicine wheel, we think of direction, we think of migration, we think of all these kinds of things, but it's also a sense of completion in terms of how it is that we use this as a way of projecting our own sense of self as we move through our own life cycle. And as individuals and as collectives, as we move through this life cycle, then essentially that helps to define how it is that we progress in terms of looking at 7 generations planning. And there we think of it from the standpoint of our great-grandparents, our grandparents, our parents as the ancestors, and then ourselves currently living in the middle generation, and then looking at our children, our grandchildren, and our great-grandchildren. And that all of this really represents a collective. And when we look at the sense of healthy community, all of those voices should be present if in fact it is a healthy community. And they may not be directly related to you, but they do represent that kind of relationship to somebody within the community. So when we think of it from the standpoint of collective engagement, we look at it in the standpoint of every voice then essentially contributing to that discussion, especially when we apply it to strategic planning and visioning. So an example of this is something that we framed with a project that we did with the Isleta del Sur in El Paso, Texas. It's a Pueblo community that essentially was displaced in the 1680s, and as a result, resettled in El Paso from their homelands, which were in the eastern side of the Manzano Mountains. But they came to us with this particular situation of trying to think about how they could establish a cultural corridor in the face of increased urbanization and pressure that was imposing within their traditional territory. And what was kind of key to that discussion was the fact that no matter how much they tried to look at it from the standpoint of imposing their own notion of sovereign authority by putting these kind of markers on the periphery saying you're on trust land, Indian land, abide by our rules, people were not really abiding by that. And our role was to really, in a sense, sort of look at it from the standpoint of placemaking and saying, how is it that you can essentially, through design, through infrastructure development, through the way that you actually project your own identity, then tell people that they're entering into a special place and that they need to abide by respecting that place. But what this depicts is essentially a discussion that we began to launch with regards to what is it that an individual themselves went through in terms of their own particular life journey. And in particular, how can we put it within the framework and perspective of a community that sustains itself, and in particular, place it from the standpoint of the fact that every individual, that the village has a responsibility to make sure that individual essentially meets its own expectation and promise to the fullest extent. So we developed this model with the idea of demonstrating how it is that we could show that journey in terms of values and then be able to match it with the kind of institutions that they themselves had within their own kind of community. And literally, it was a light bulb moment because nobody had really ever sort of brought that kind of conceptual modeling and assigned it from the standpoint of asking a fundamental question of what do we do and why is it that we do it? So in order to understand this, that red line there, that curve, which is really a sine curve, represents the life journey of an individual through a cycle of time. And the horizontal timeline really represents this kind of longitudinal timeline that we all know in Western application of the past to the future in terms of the linear dimension. But in order to sort of understand it, I'm going to show illustration here that basically will show you that life circle. And if you take a tangent point on that circle, as you move that circle continuously at a constant speed across the horizontal plane, then what it will do is it will map out that sine curve. So that tangent really represents your point in that time and that cycle of life as you move through this. And what it does is it maps out your journey along that longitudinal line. So here's how it's moving. And you can see that tangent line going as it's going through its completion. So you're halfway through your lifetime, and then you finally end up passing on. And at that point, then you pass that on to the next generation. So if we look at it from the standpoint of how it is then that it's applied in this model, then we ask the community, then how is it that you see an individual participating within your own community? So at birth, then young people begin to understand meanings. They begin to look at their values. They learn their language. As teenagers, then they assume traditions. They begin to develop roles, skills. And then as adults, they begin to attain positions and responsibilities, become leaders, become parents. And this then is maintained as they move into elderhood. They continue their connection, and they then are passers of the tradition. They have the knowledge of the past, and they have that connection. Ultimately, they begin the teaching on to the next generation, which is going to take over after they pass away. So what we asked then, what were the institutions then that actually helped to support that journey? And they began to identify the fact that, yes, they had an intergenerational learning center for the youth. They had a nation building hub program for their teenagers. They had a multi-generational place for their adults. They came from a tradition of gardening and crops, agriculture. And then also they were still considering whether they were going to develop a senior center in order to support those activities. So that light bulb moment was basically them then realizing that each one of these then had a particular role within the journey of an individual within that community, and that that's essentially how they distributed their resources in order to make sure that every one of them could reach their own particular full potential. We're using the same model right now in order to look at visioning and developing a blueprint for education here in the state of New Mexico, because I think too often our communities are faced with what we call siloing, where you've got programs that coexist and may even share walls in some cases, but they don't really communicate with each other because they don't discuss it from the standpoint of how is it that individuals actually move through these kinds of journeys in a way then that becomes accumulative and comprehensive, and that at the very end also acknowledges that each individual's path is their own, but at the same time that the community, in terms of its collective responsibility, has that notion of being able to build on each of the individual experiences in order to lend substance to the whole.